session with us. So I thought we might give a quick bit more of a background about ourselves. Graham, if you could give us a quick 5 minutes.
Yep, it won't even be 5 minutes, I promise you that. So my name's Graham Grovum. I founded Alpha Creates with Eric probably just over 18 months ago. Prior to that, I worked at Corus Chambers Westgarth, which is a large Australian national firm. I spent 11 years there and the last 4 years of that as their head of innovation. So I got a lot of exposure to working obviously with the practice groups directly, but also with the firm's clients to figure out how we can improve not just the delivery of legal services in this case, but also the way those legal services are consumed once they reach the customer. So that's me in a very short nutshell.
Nice. So whilst Graham was doing all this really cool stuff in looking at technology and process optimization, I spent the last 10 years in the professional service environment as a strategy consultant. If I were to pull in on some of the things that I've seen in the last sort of 10 years, 10 years ago, a lot of the questions that we get asked that hasn't changed really is how do we grow for management team? Whilst the question hasn't changed, the how has changed. So 10 years ago, it was really helping firms with deciding on practice specialization or sector specialization. And that transitioned really quickly into geographic expansion and mergers and acquisition, which then transitioned really quickly again into globalization from the legal market perspective, and also for the consulting engineering perspective. And what came next is really the rise of the alternatives, whether it is outsourcing that has entered both the legal market or the engineering market. And then the freelance economy entered the market as well, which gave opportunity for clients as well as firms to look at different ways you could staff your firm on projects. And in the last sort of 3 years, we saw the rise of technology, more so in the legal industry, where there's been a rise in the number of legal tech providers in the market. So for context, the Australian market has about 140 odd legal tech providers in the market, which is a really large number when you think about it as a potential consumer of those legal tech products in the market. Which is why Graham and I have come together to co-found Alpha Creates, essentially help firms through that process of looking at technology as well as the innovation journey and strategy. The dots on the world map are essentially where we have worked previously with our clients. We're also involved in building a grassroots movement around technology and innovation, particularly in the legal market. So Graham is a co-founder of Sydney Legal Hackers. I'm a co-founder of Legal Hackers Melbourne. I'm also a co-founder of regional legal tech association in Southeast Asia called ASEAN Legal Tech. So let's talk about data. What all of the sort of trends that we have seen really created a hyper-competitive environment, which means we're seeing more and more importance being placed on data-driven decisions. Ultimately, data-driven making decisions really at firms means being compelled by data instead of intuition or personal experience of the partners that you work with. And you can apply this in the BD function, and it actually makes a lot of sense. If you take a step back and look at sort of the role of BD in a buyer funnel, for example, marketing sets the scene for business development. So if you think about a buyer funnel, there are really 6 stages from awareness, consideration, shortlisting, final decision, assessment, all the way through to loyalty or exit. The BD function actually plays an important role for guiding consultants and lawyers to help them win work and keep clients. So there are really 3 distinct functions when we see it with business development. There's build and maintain the sales pipeline, position the practitioners of your firm to win work. And then once the work is won, it's client relationship management to keep the client within the firm. And given those 3 distinct functions you have with BD professionals, what we see is really the specialization in different parts of work coming through, where there are BD professionals that specialize in particular in BD coaching and support for the practitioners as they go through the process. And then there's also creating internal sort of processes and robust systems to evaluate opportunities and also rally internal resources as well to prioritize pursuits. And then finally, managing the client journey across the firm through different stages of the buyer funnel. Now, the BD function is also in a really unique position because essentially you cut across the internal silos that tend to sit within firms, whereas usually it's either defined by practice group, by client sector, or by offices, which means the BD function is crucial in being that single point of contact for the clients to be able to access the wider firm resources. So a lot of what we'll be sharing in this session is really not rocket science. It's actually leveraging data that you have already collected in the course of doing business, whether it's through your CRM program or your practice management system. And it's really about creating an engaging experience for the partners that you work with to help them through a data-driven conversation, really, around BD training and coaching, identifying cross-selling opportunities, strategic planning for each of those practice groups that you work with, better targeting, and key account programs. And also the other side to this as well is the way we work with data is really to create visualization for the partners so that they can engage and probe the data as well. A lot of the analysis that we do is really in service of usually strategy partner retreats that we run for firms. And we think there are a lot of opportunities from a BD function perspective to apply this in your work with your partnership. So I'm going to hand the screen over now to Graham, who will show us a couple of the visualization examples that we have done.
All right, thanks, Eric. So I'm just sharing my screen here. And that should be visible to everyone now. And I apologize, I'm going to look off at my second screen now. So it's not that I'm ignoring you all, I'm just looking this way. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a visualization that we've created for the fictitious firm Pearson Spector Lit. And what we've done here is, as Eric had mentioned, we're using available existing data. So this is all billing data from a fictional firm. And what we've done is we've tried to create a way that is more kind of accessible to the partnership in looking at the different ways that these teams are interacting. So in this visualization, it's a network graph. And what we've done is we've put it together to visually kind of depict how the different kind of setup is with partners and the fee earners that are working for those partners, and to what extent there's actually kind of billing that's crossing over between those boundaries. So having a look here first, we can have a look at an example that is pretty good. So we've got Mike Ross here, who's in litigation. The practice of Mike is just under 5 million. And you can see that there's a good distribution in this case of fairly senior lawyers working at going all the way down to junior workers. Now, one of the interesting things about Mike's practice is that we've got in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see regulatory, which is light blue. We've got a darker blue, which is litigation, and we've got workplace relations, which is purple or violet. This is a 3-practice firm, but what we're looking at with Mike is that although he's predominantly focused on litigation, he is to an extent drawing in assistance from lawyers in other practices. So this is a great example of kind of getting a good broad base of leverage in your practice. Now, we can contrast that a bit if we'd like to. And so this is all interactive as well, which is kind of a side story to this, but when you're thinking about the partners that you're working with, one of the best ways I think to engage them and actually get them to start thinking more about this information is to give them something to play with. And this is exactly that. So there's a kind of guilty little pleasure of just sitting there and delving into the data, whether it's your data or looking at how you interact with your partners to see kind of how everything fits together. So while it is pretty riotous when we look at everything, we can certainly isolate different examples. Now, we looked at Mike and that was pretty good, although pretty uniform in focusing on litigation. If we look over at Harvey Spector here, it's the same thing, although Harvey in this case is working with a lot of kind of smaller fee earners. So more junior and more varied in terms of the practice areas that they're coming in from as well. But another great example of setting up leverage with a mix of different kind of seniorities working for the partner. Now, to contrast that, we can look over here at Harold Gunderson. Harold is doing pretty well in terms of fees billed as well. So we're sitting at just over 3 million. But when you look at Harold's billing pattern, it's immediately apparent that the vast majority of revenue that's coming in to his practice is generated by himself and one other senior practitioner. So while you could just compare on a revenue basis the different practices and say, well, this looks pretty good in both positions, the reality is that this practice specifically is quite at risk if the other practitioner decides to leave for whatever reason. And it's not really spread out in terms of bringing in many across the firm to contribute to the practice as well. So now it could be that this is a junior partner that's just been promoted and needs time to build up that business. And that very likely is the case. But it could also be that it's just an alternative style of working, where it's not so much that there's the relationship building going on as it is heads down, and I'm used to churning out the work as opposed to going out and finding the work and getting others to participate in doing it. Okay, those are, yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to add to that as well. Basically, if I look at this visualization, it's kind of looking at the DNA of the firm through the billing data that you already collect in your practice management systems anyway. And it's about visualizing really quickly, whether it's cross-pollination or practitioners across different practice areas. One of the key things that we find with firms is that ideally you want to have practices that are cross-selling and cross-pollinizing because you get better outcomes for the clients. You get a much more sticky client as well. Oops, sorry there.
Sorry about that, guys.
It's okay. Much sticky client because the more, and we've done this analysis with a few firms where the more a client buys from a firm by practice areas or offices, they tend to be more profitable as a client. And you can start to see, for example, Harvey Specter in this sort of visualization example that we've done, sort of probe, okay, how is it that Harvey is able to build a much more diverse practice than, say, Harold Gunderson? Let's look at some of the learnings from Harvey Specter and then see if we could codify that into the training program, BD training program within the firm. So those are the key sort of insights that we see coming out of this. And to Graham's point as well, whenever we do this kind of visualization post-partners retreat, we get asked by the management team to get access to it because it's hosted in sort of we can host this in a private environment where it's password protected. And the partners would love to go in it and just to probe and see where they are vis-a-vis their sort of neighbors in the office, right? How do I compare with someone who's next door? And so on and so forth.
Okay. Now, if there's nothing more on this, what I'll do is we'll go on to the next visualization here. And this really picks up on what Eric was just speaking about as well. And by the way, to the extent that any questions are surfacing, we'd be very happy to take them kind of as and when they come up. So we can deal with any questions at the end, or we can just have them interjected at any point, and that's no problem at all. So this is another network map, and this one is really cool, if you're into network maps at least. In what we're looking at here is the same data again. So we're looking at exactly the same information, which you recall is really dry where we get it from. So it's from your time capture system, but what you can actually do with it turns into some pretty interesting stuff. So looking at this, we've got the kind of purple here that is all over the place. Those are the clients, okay? So we're looking at how the different clients of this firm are connected to the different practice groups. Now, the circles that are not colored purple are the different practice groups. So we've got employment and workplace safety, corporate and commercial, mergers and acquisitions, etc. But what's really interesting is when you visualize it this way, you can very quickly start to investigate and find those clients that, first of all, do have a good spread across the firm. So they're engaging with the different practice areas, and you can contrast that to those clients who may bring in a lot of revenue to the firm, but only in a specific practice area. And then the question becomes, how do we actually take the dynamics of the relationships for those clients that do have a good spread across practice groups and bring those learnings into the scenarios where we've got a client that is only engaging with a specific practice group. So just by mousing over a specific client, we can see, and this, of course, these clients are just taken from a list of companies. There's nothing specific about this, so don't apply any kind of information to the different names of the clients in here. But we can just see at a glance here, we can see that there's 4 main clients. One of them is growing in the M&A side, and then with the other ones, they're all pretty equal. And just by mousing over the different clients, we get a really good feeling for how these clients are connected across the firm. And so it's not something where you have to go into a spreadsheet and you have to start interrogating it and seeing if you can make sense of the data, which many of us in professional services aren't that good at, frankly, right? It's something where if you can depict it visually, you're going to get a much higher success rate in terms of people being able to interact with the information and glean something from it.
And the other side to that as well is once you look at the data, visualize the data in this way, you can start to look at what are some of the key clients that spend with different practice areas or different offices across the board. And you can start to think about key client account management identification, basically. And it's just basically visualizing the data you already have and to be able to show it to the partnership and say, here's why we need to invest in, let's say, computer share, because they're spending in all those practice areas that we have, and we need to help our practitioners basically have a much more concerted and strategic effort towards building that client account. And here's why.
Good. Okay. So the last visualization that we want to discuss today is not a network map. So we're switching it up here. What this is, it's called a tree map. And what this is again, looking at exactly the same information. So this is just billing data. But what we're looking at here is realization on fees billed. So we've got in our scenario, the 3 different practice groups, and we've got a number of different offices for the firm. So they're a national firm. The violet color is 90% or greater realization on average. The dark blue is 80%. And the light blue is 75% or less realization average. Now, what I really like about this is at a glance, you can see on a client by client basis. So we can see, for example, the client 0002 here has got work on in all of the offices, whereas 0997 is just Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. But outside of that, and maybe I'll just take you in here. So we can also drill down into the information. If we're interested in client 0997, we can go into that client and see what that work looks like for that client within the specific offices and which of the partners in those offices are doing how much work on that client's bill with the firm. So you can continue to drill down in, obviously, as you would with your billing data to see precise information about the specific matters that are being worked on. But back out here at the highest level, I think what's really interesting is that you get a sense almost immediately of where your pockets of work that are perhaps not worth doing are. So if we think about the different types of work that are being done in this firm, we can see down in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got a huge collection of small matters that are low in terms of their realization average. And a question that many probably aren't asking, because we've got this approach generally, I think, that any matter is a good matter, is that we need to sometimes step back and say, okay, hang on a second. Is there a type of matter that we shouldn't be doing as a firm? So do we consistently engage in pieces of work that never achieve profitability? There's a metric that you can actually identify in your firms of when a profit or when a matter is profitable. And if you can identify a type of work that's being done that never achieves profitability, maybe it's just too small, maybe the administrative side of it is too great for the size of the work that needs to be done, this is a great way to actually identify it. So go in and explore just these types of matters as a first start and see how you can move everything into the dark blue and then into the violet. All right, was there anything you wanted to add to this visualization in specific, Eric?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's a really good way to visualize sort of your targeting effort as well. Essentially, obviously, you want to target or put more effort into clients that have higher realization rates. There are also different analysis that you could do as well with this visual analysis. You could apply the same to debtor days for clients as well. There's some clients that are much better at paying within 30 days or 60 days than others. And so on and so forth. So these are just some examples in terms of what you can look at with the visualization analysis. Again, it comes to the sort of the ability to query the data, not just by looking at an Excel sheet. I mean, a lot of the time what we found is all of this data actually sit within practice management system, and firms do have reporting around it. It's more the ability for the partners to go into the data to sort of interrogate it in a way that's more accessible. It's where we found this is super useful.
Can I just ask you both the mechanics of if you go to a firm that has all this raw data stored in its practice management system, how long does it take you to turn that data into something useful like these slides that you're showing us today?
Yeah, so it can be pretty quick, and it depends, I guess, on what is looking to be achieved. So a one-off report, for example, you want to take time to make sure it's polished correctly and then deliver it in whatever the fashion is that the firm needs. So that might be that it's just accessing it through our website, no problem. Or it might be that they want to host it internally on their intranet. So you'll need to make sure that you've got the HTML set up correctly so they can do that. But those are mechanics. Overall, it's not a lengthy process as long as the data itself isn't too dirty or messy. And usually you get a pretty good outcome for most of the data that's collected in these time capture systems, but I think we can all admit that firms have their quirks. So for example, there may be an internal edict in one of your offices that everyone uses PED for everything. For perusing and reviewing, and another may decide that this needs to actually be set up to capture exactly what you're doing, or that may change on a client-by-client basis. So while superficially it appears that you're correctly capturing time, there's nuances that need to be dealt with so that it doesn't misrepresent what's happening at the firm level, especially if there's more than one office.
Thinking also about the types of work that BD people do in professional services, could you also do data visualization around things like win-loss ratios of pursuits and bids? Because one of the biggest things we get is that a lot of money and time is spent on bid management, for instance. So have you done work, or can you see that you'd be able to do visualization around the return on investment for that input?
That's a great question and a great idea. And the answer is that yes, we could visualize that, absolutely. The limits of visualization really only rest on the data collection side. So as long as there's robust data collection and there are data points, we can visualize it. That's not a problem at all. Some of the different use cases that we've used this exact visualization for that's on the screen right now are doing SWOT analyses of partner sentiment of how their firm is performing. So I mean, that has nothing to do with data visualization at all, you would think, but it turns out that's a really good way of engaging the partnership and letting them share their feelings and then anonymizing it. And as a collective, they can look at it and explore it themselves as well and say, well, this is how we feel as a group about the way the firm is headed in this aspect, or just generally about how leadership is handling different aspects of the partnership. So what we found over the course of doing visualizations for different clients is really the output is secondary to the data. As long as we can collect the data properly, or the data has been collected properly, we can really look at any different facet of a firm.
I got another question from the floor. They're coming in thick and fast. Can you tell us who within firms is using these tools? Is it partners accessing the information, or is it BD teams or commercial managers, for instance?
Yeah, so another great question, and it really, I think, depends on what the focus is. So in our engagements and strategy work, it is the partnership generally, because it's a lot of kind of strategy sessions that go into that. But I think if you just kind of reflect on who is actually doing a lot of the dashboarding work in a typical firm, you're going to see that a lot of it rests on the business services side of the firm. And at least in my experience, it's often quite difficult to engage the partnership properly in some of the findings that you have. And so one of the ways that we like to think this alleviates that difficulty is it's something novel where they can go and play with the data rather than just looking at a table and saying, okay, well, this is where things sit this week or this month or this quarter.
And Graham, are we able to ask questions ourselves, or do we have to go through you as the host?
Well, that was a good first question. So yes, I would say you can.
I think you can, Damien, yes.
I've unleashed. Obviously you can see the benefits of visualization. When you start to work with a company, how much work is generally needed to be done to get the data into a useful form for you to be able to then do this kind of visualization?
It's not, yeah, sorry, I cut you off there. Okay, it's not a ton, to be honest, because one of the benefits, at least on the legal side of professional services, and I think it's the same more generally, is that we've got a very tried and true approach to how we capture time. And so as long as it's a time captured analysis, this is something that we are very good at as an industry, right? While we might not be so good with other aspects of doing things with that information, we're at least very good at capturing the information. So where this actually sits, it'll be probably just in a SQL server, and there'll be tables that people have been entering their time on different matters. That can be exported as a CSV file, and we can operate off that. That's no problem at all.
The biggest difference to data, I think, that we have seen really is in terms of the scale of the data, and that's really because there's a massive difference in sort of the size of the data by national firms versus international firms versus a single city firm. And I remember when we looked at one that's a big national firm, and the sort of bubble screen that you saw before just got filled out really quickly. But yeah, you can do a lot of visual analysis on the sort of practice management sort of system data that you already have, which is sort of where we've come from, essentially accessing the data you already have and then putting a different lens to it, basically.
Yeah, and just kind of reflecting while Eric was speaking there on the earlier question that you'd asked around what can be visualized. I mean, we've done work with a firm that was just trying to figure out who they were using for their search providers. And so we were just visualizing that for them. And that worked perfectly, again, because you can see at a glance, okay, well, these offices are using InfoTrack almost exclusively. These ones over here are using Global X, or maybe they're using SAI Global. And this is not something that anybody really had their head around other than within the finance team figuring this out on a month-by-month basis. So being able to at a glance understand, okay, this is the way that we're using our different providers in different scenarios helps them then come up with a plan going forward of how to be strategic about it.
A more recent visualization that we've done as well is to do a heat map of file allocation for particular practice areas where you have high consistency of volume, and we can start to look at, for a very particular niche type of work within that particular practice group, who is the most consistently been working on this type of particular niche file within the practice group as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because while it's not straight up a business development priority, maybe what it does do is it lets you make sure that you are properly preserving knowledge within the firm, right? So if you've got just that sole expert, that it's not really apparent that this is the only person doing this work, but it turns out that way, and that person decides to leave, that's a risk from a business perspective for the firm. So being able to keep an eye on that, make sure that there's cross-training happening just by monitoring the billing codes that are being entered is a pretty interesting way of approaching that problem.
And the other side to that as well is succession planning, where we've done another analysis where we look at fees breakdown by age of the partners, for example, and a good succession plan chart would essentially look like a bell curve, whereas a bad succession planning chart would where you have high concentration of fees in sort of partners who are closer to retirement, for example, in the age group perspective.
All right, well, that's the last of the visualizations that we'd planned on showing to everyone today, but a little plug never hurts. So I'm going to refer everyone, if they're interested, to the FY20 War for Talent in the Australian legal industry report that we've just put out, and it's available on our website. And to the extent you're interested in data visualization, we've got a whole host of other visualizations as well. So it's worth checking out if you haven't had a look at it yet.
Thanks so much for that. I've got some questions, if you don't mind taking some more questions that have been fielded through. Are you able to talk to us, when you showed us a slide, which was, I think it was slide number 5, if I can remember, which was the sort of the cross-selling slide. What other relation?
I'll just bring that back up.
Yep. Yeah, I just wondered what other relationship type data you have been able to visualize from it, and that's great from a cross-selling. But for instance, are you able to? Have you done relationship maps like this before in terms of how clients move across the firm, or how sectorization of a particular BD strategy can impact on business development?
So that's a really good question. One of the recent things that we were asked by an accounting firm was whether it's possible to create a network map, not just by fees, but by interaction with the client. But it comes down to what is the data point we're looking at. Is it email interaction? Is it outside of the firm environment, the individual sort of social network, let's say LinkedIn connections? We're limited by the sort of outside the firm data point because obviously there's a lot of privacy issues that comes with it. But what we could do is, if you track, for example, ins and outs of email interactions with the clients or potential client on your CRM system, we can actually run the same visualization as well. So you can see, for example, let's say client A has 10 or 4 or 10 or 20 people so coming into that particular client or potential client as a touch point.
And can you do it in reverse? Can you look at clients and say, okay, there might be the general counsel, for instance, a law firm, there might be general counsel, but there are also, we've identified 20 or 30 other contacts at that firm. Can you look at how that engagement works and where the strongest networks are within that business?
It goes back again to the quality of the data, right? But absolutely, and that's an important kind of aspect. Is it's great that the GC has a good relationship with the partner, but let's start looking at the successively junior levels and make sure that those relationships are being built up as seniority kind of progresses, because you want to make sure that you've got your senior associates that are working with corporate counsel, and you want to make sure that that goes all the way down, so that those relationships remain sticky even if the partner decides to move.
And I've had another question about marketing. Have you, or could you use these tools to look at marketing activity tracking, like marketing spend on sort of pitches, directories, that type of thing, to look at how useful it and how effective it's being?
Eric, do you want to go or should I? Eric may be frozen. I'm not sure if he is or not. So I'll go. What I think we could do, and I apologize, but this is the same answer again, which is, to the extent that you've got robust data about that area, we can absolutely visualize it and put it into a view that helps you understand it at a glance and maybe surfaces insights that you otherwise weren't aware of. But the big problem that we find a lot of the time with this sort of thing, and it's one of the reasons that we gravitate like we do to time capture data, is that other data sets are just too spotty. So while some data collection is good, in other areas it's not. And there is no kind of common threshold that at least is required, as with time capture, where people can be good or bad at it, but all that means is they're doing it as they complete the work versus they're at 9:30 on Friday night trying to remember what they did all week. In both cases, it's going to be in the system. For every other system, it's kind of hit or miss. Well, I'm too busy to do that, so I'm just not going to do it. I'm opting myself out. So that's really the biggest limiting factor in visualizing anything else. But to the extent that you've got a data set that you are happy with the internal consistency of it, we can absolutely visualize it regardless of what the underlying kind of content is.
And can Alpha Creates help organizations to develop those data sets? So for instance, if you were a CMO of a small firm that maybe hadn't had sophisticated data sets of this type of thing in the past, can you go in and actually help them find that information and set up templates and stuff?
100%. And the reality is the collection and capture of this information isn't necessarily that sophisticated, and it doesn't need to be. All it needs to be is kind of robust in terms of making sure it happens consistently. But we are very happy to be able to point out the things that you need to think about when you are capturing information in order to have an internally coherent and robust data model that you can visualize for sure.
Great. We might open it up to see if anybody else has any other questions to ask of you while we have you in the room, Zoom room, so to speak. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to either come off mute and ask, or you can contact us directly. No. Well, what we can do, we will share the Zoom recording with all of you, and you can circulate it. You can also contact Alpha Creates directly. I'll provide you with their email address, which is probably already on their slide, I think, isn't it? Hopefully that has been helpful in terms of how you can help your marketing and BD teams help fee earners visualize the efforts that you put into your business development. So thank you very much for joining us here today, and we look forward to speaking to you all again at some point in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks.